Hey everyone, and welcome back to another gentle drift through the less glamorous corners of history. Tonight, we begin with a slow descent into the quiet corridors of ancient Egypt, not the golden splendor, not the towering pyramids shining under the desert sun, but something a little stranger, and perhaps more human. This evening, we're setting our sights on the everyday oddities, routines, and rather unsettling habits of Egypt's most famous rulers. Pharaohs may have been gods on earth in name, but their actual lives were often full of uncomfortable rituals, peculiar beliefs, and some truly awkward expectations, like never being allowed to sweat or smile the wrong way. It's a life of ceremony, sandals, and sleep-depriving superstition, and tonight we'll explore it one dreamy step at a time. If you enjoy these sleepy dives into the overlooked and the underwhelming, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. No pressure at all. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always lovely to know where in the world we're unwinding together. Now's a good time to dim the lights, maybe cozy up under a warm blanket, or let the hum of a fan keep you company as we drift into the desert dusk. Let your body go soft, your breath slow, and with that, let's slip into the past together. You might think being pharaoh meant waking up in luxury silken sheets, gold-framed windows, maybe a harpist or two playing a soft morning melody. But the truth was far less serene. The pharaoh did enjoy an elite status that none could question. His mornings were less about indulgence and more about obligation. He was, after all, not merely a king. He was a living god, a divine bridge between the heavens and the Nile Valley. And that came with a long checklist. Each morning began not with peace, but performance. Before the first light brushed across the limestone of the palace, attendants, dozens of them, were already active. They weren't just there to help the pharaoh rise. They had scripts, literally. Ritual texts dictated every gesture, every item used, every prayer murmured in the background. If a linen wrap was folded improperly, or the water wasn't poured with the correct invocation, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a cosmic disturbance. The world, in a sense, depended on the pharaoh being properly bathed and dressed. Bathing, for instance, was a production. In a desert kingdom where water was life, the pharaoh had access to rare imported scents, and sometimes even palm-wrapped buckets of perfumed water, cooled with lotus petals. But this wasn't for pleasure, it was purification. Cleanliness was seen as essential to spiritual balance. He wasn't merely getting the dust off his limbs. He was cleansing the body of earthly distractions before stepping into the sacred role of morning prayer and governance. Then came the oils, dozens of them. Myrrh for the shoulders, frankincense for the chest, lotus for the forehead. These weren't just status symbols, though they certainly served that function. Each oil had a ritual use, tied to a deity, to healing, or to magical protection. The pharaoh's skin didn't just smell expensive. It acted like a votive tablet, a walking offering to the gods, to protect Egypt from the chaos of the world outside its borders. After the oils, it was time for the wig. Contrary to popular belief, most pharaohs and elite Egyptians in general shaved their heads. This wasn't a matter of vanity. It was about hygiene. Hair was seen as a trap for impurity and lice. They were elaborate, often decorated with lapis lazuli, gold filaments, or even scented wax cones that would slowly melt throughout the day, perfuming the air. But they were heavy, itchy, and hot. Imagine wearing a braided oven mitt on your head while walking through 100-degree shade, getting dressed, involved, layers. Despite the heat, the pharaoh often wore ceremonial garments that were stiff with starch and symbolism: a pleated kilt, a ceremonial sash, necklaces bearing the image of Horus or the Eye of Ra. Every item had to be arranged just so, or else risk offending divine forces, and he rarely dressed himself. Dressing the pharaoh took a team, some to clothe, some to chant, some to anoint. Privacy was, to put it gently, not part of the royal experience, and once clothed and adorned, he still wasn't ready to greet the day. The pharaoh had to perform rituals in a private chapel, burning incense, offering bread to the gods, reciting passages from sacred scrolls. He was expected to act as priest, ruler, and symbol, all before breakfast. But what did he eat, you might wonder? Was it golden goblets of wine and figs from Nubia? That, dear listener, is another part of the morning, and far more humbling than you'd expect. So, we've bathed our god king, shaved his head, oiled his limbs, and weighed his scalp down, with a wig that likely caused more headaches than blessings. Now comes the most human part of the pharaoh's morning breakfast. But don't get too excited. If you imagined piles of exotic fruits and roasted game arriving on golden trays, while doves fluttered and harps played softly in the background, you might want to temper your expectations. Breakfast in the royal palace was more about stability than splendor. The pharaoh's meals were certainly better than what most Egyptians ate, which, for the record, wasn't hard to accomplish when the average laborer subsisted on beer, onions, and coarse bread. Still, even the King of Kings was tied to the rhythms of agriculture, religion, and ritual. His first meal of the day was structured not around taste, but symbolism. Bread baked from the first grains of the harvest, fermented from sacred yeasts, occasionally dates, figs, or fish if they passed ritual inspection. Every bite, whose job descriptions read more like mystical bureaucrats than royal chefs. Food tasters were another layer in the morning machinery. Poison wasn't just a fear for medieval monarchs. Even in the land of pyramids and papyrus, assassins could be found. So before the pharaoh could so much as nibble on a honey-dipped fig, a dedicated official had already sampled it, and hopefully survived long enough to nod. What made breakfast more bizarre was its audience. The pharaoh almost never ate alone. His high priests might be present to bless the offerings. Royal scribes could be taking notes on his preferences or reactions. Palace officials hovered nearby, waiting for an instruction, a glance, even a gesture of approval. It was breakfast as spectacle, ceremonial nourishment, before stepping into the machinery of power. And then came the paperwork. You wouldn't think someone who's technically a living god would need to deal with administrative files, grain tallies, or tax complaints, but you'd be wrong. The pharaoh's palace was the empire's beating bureaucratic heart. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of clay tablets and scrolls flowed in daily. There were decisions to be made about irrigation canals, tomb construction, festival arrangements, priestly appointments, livestock censuses, and foreign correspondence, often all before noon, and every single action was recorded. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, not just for functional reasons, but because they believed that writing something down made it sacred, permanent, real. So while the pharaoh dictated responses to Hittite envoys or debated which god's temple should get new funding, scribes sat cross-legged nearby, carving every syllable into wax or clay with exhausting precision. The pharaoh's words weren't just royal, they were divine law. And divine law needed excellent penmanship. If you're starting to get the sense that pharaohs didn't exactly lounge their way through life, you'd be correct. In fact, much of the day was consumed not with relaxing on ivory couches, but with performing symbolic duties that reinforced Mat, the cosmic order. If a festival was approaching, the pharaoh might need to personally bless cattle, oversee temple renovations, or perform dances or chants alongside priests. And while that might sound colorful and festive, it was a demanding, repetitive responsibility, especially when you consider that even something as seemingly harmless as sneezing during a ritual could be interpreted as a sign from the gods. Often not a good one. Sometimes he even had to pretend he was multiple gods at once. During certain ceremonies, the pharaoh embodied different deities in sequence, adopting different outfits and movements depending on the moment. It was theater on a divine scale, not optional, not metaphorical. The entire kingdom's harmony supposedly hung on it, and, as if his own schedule wasn't enough, the pharaoh also had to monitor everyone else's. His advisors brought regular reports on regional governors, military garrisons, and temple politics. Every plot, every rumor, every grain surplus or shortfall was his concern. Even dreams, yes, dreams came up in official briefings. Some priests specialized in interpreting them. And if a pharaoh dreamed of, say, a crocodile on fire eating the moon, they'd consult dream scrolls to explain what it meant for the next harvest. But amid all this work, there was one responsibility that loomed heavier than the others, a task that no pharaoh could escape, no matter how powerful, a duty that demanded years of preparation, and ironically, could only be appreciated after death. The pharaoh had to build his own tomb. For most people in ancient Egypt, death was a fact to be feared or endured. Project. The moment a ruler ascended the throne, one of his most pressing concerns wasn't war, taxes, or even governance. It was tomb design. That's right. From the first ceremonial headdress to the final breath, decades later, a pharaoh's reign was shadowed by the need to construct a suitable gateway to eternity. This wasn't vanity, at least not entirely. Egyptian belief held that the afterlife was not a vague realm of spirits, but a real, vivid continuation of earthly life, only better, assuming you got there properly. But to reach it, the pharaoh had to be buried in a structure worthy of a god, and not just buried, prepared, preserved, protected. Everything mattered: the shape of the tomb, the alignment with the stars, the goods placed inside, the prayers chanted over the body, even the quality of the stone used to line the burial chamber. The planning began early. Architects, priests, and engineers were summoned and sworn to secrecy. The location of a royal tomb was classified knowledge, revealing it could risk looters, which was more than just an economic concern. A desecrated tomb wasn't just a financial loss, it could condemn the pharaoh's soul to wander forever, unable to join Osiris in the field of reeds. So plans were whispered in dark corners and chiseled into hidden scrolls. Sometimes, even the workers themselves didn't know the full design. They were assigned sections, blind to the whole. Some pharaohs opted for traditional pyramid shapes, grand monuments to their divine nature. But over time, these towering symbols fell out of favor. They were too obvious, too tempting for tomb robbers. Later rulers buried themselves deep within cliffs, carving winding tunnels through the Valley of the Kings, hoping complexity would succeed where intimidation had failed. Of course, no tomb was complete without its contents, and the list was long. Furniture, food, clothing, weapons, jewelry, toys, perfumes, servants, everything a pharaoh might need in the next life had to be placed in the tomb ahead of time. And if the pharaoh wanted servants who wouldn't rebel in eternity, they could use Shabdis, small carved figurines enchanted with spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to spring to life on command in the afterlife and do the pharaoh's bidding. But the most important preparation, the body itself, the pharaoh's body, had to be perfect. If it decayed, if it was damaged, if the preservation failed, the spirit might not recognize its own vessel and get lost. So began the infamous mummification process. The best embalmers in the land were chosen. Each organ was removed, dried, and stored in jars, guarded by protective deities. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul and intellect, was sometimes left inside, unless, of course, the embalmers feared its testimony in the afterlife might condemn the pharaoh, in which case it might mysteriously go missing. The body was wrapped with hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, each with embedded amulets and inscriptions. Spells were whispered, resin was applied, faces were sometimes molded with gold. Offerings were made, guards were posted, traps were occasionally set, not just to confuse grave robbers, but as symbolic guardians of the afterlife journey. Some tombs had fake corridors, others had curse inscriptions designed to terrify future intruders. It wasn't always enough, but the attempt mattered. In the end, the pharaoh's life, for all its jewels, rituals, and proclamations, was a ceaseless march toward a good death. His days were filled with performance, his nights with planning. He governed not just for his people, but for his own immortality. Every tax he levied, every monument he raised, every prayer he chanted, all of it fed a single question. Would he be remembered forever? Or would sand, silence, and time erase the God-King entirely? And somewhere beneath a sun-scorched hill, beneath paintings of stars and jackals, his wrapped body lies, waiting to see if eternity was worth the paperwork. From afar, the idea of a pharaoh as a living god seems simple, exalted, unquestioned, and swaddled in divine authority. But in practice, divinity in ancient Egypt came with paperwork, a lot of it. To be pharaoh was not just to wear a crown and hold a crook and flail. It was to manage a sprawling system of cosmic expectations, bureaucratic machinery, and religious obligations so elaborate it could make your head spin faster than a scarab. In sunlight, the Egyptian people didn't merely believe their pharaoh ruled because of the gods. They believed he was a god, or at least a necessary vessel through which the gods kept the world from sliding into chaos. This wasn't metaphor. This was doctrine. Every law he passed, every breath he took, was tied to Mat, the divine principle of balance, harmony, and order. If the pharaoh faltered, even in ritual, the Nile might dry up, the crops might fail, and enemies might invade. So, no pressure. One might think this divine status meant power without limits. But here's the strange twist. The more divine a pharaoh was, the more limited he became. Every appearance, gesture, or proclamation had to reflect divine will. That meant he couldn't change his mind on a whim. This celestial king actually ruled through a staggering pyramid. No, not that kind of scribes, priests, viziers, and regional officials. Egypt's bureaucracy was one of the most advanced of the ancient world, and the pharaoh was at its peak and its prisoner. Dozens of ministries, agriculture, temple affairs, taxation, military provisioning, canal maintenance required his oversight. Not because he loved micromanaging, but because the people believed divine oversight was required to keep Mat intact. He ruled through decrees, yes, but also through sacred performances. For instance, when the pharaoh visited temples, he wasn't just making a public appearance. He was reenacting mythic battles, offering divine gifts, sometimes even reciting hour-long invocations written in Middle Egyptian so dense it took entire schools of scribes to memorize. These performances couldn't be shortened, cancelled, or improvised. Skipping a sacred rite was equivalent to unplugging the sun. And then there were the titles. A modern politician might hold one or two. A pharaoh held 5 simultaneously. Each came with its own duties, expectations, and public proclamations. The Horus name connected him to the falcon god and his celestial role. The two ladies' name referenced the patron goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. The golden Horus name signified eternal victory. The throne name, usually enclosed in a cartouche, was used in official state business, and the birth name, also cartouched, was the one he inherited from his earthly parents. Using the wrong name in the wrong context wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially sacrilegious. If that weren't enough, he also had to constantly manage the expectations of priests, who were themselves immensely powerful. Temples weren't just houses of worship, they were economic powerhouses. Some priests oversaw massive tracts of farmland, managed labor forces, and controlled vast treasuries. And while they honored the pharaoh's divinity, they were also experts in doctrine, which meant they could subtly question whether he was living up to his divine mandate. In practice, this gave temples quiet but immense leverage over how a pharaoh ruled, and sometimes that leverage wasn't so quiet to keep this entire apparatus functioning. That meant public parades during festivals, where he was expected to walk or be carried before his people in full regalia. The crowds might cheer, but there was no room for spontaneity. Every step was choreographed. Every phrase had to be memorized. Even the way he held his scepter had symbolic significance. And all the while, scribes recorded everything for posterity, for scrutiny, for eternity. There was no escape. Even his dreams could be interpreted as signs of divine approval or warning. And if he dared to step outside this maze of rituals and roles, if he tried to rule too boldly, too independently, or too lazily, well, the gods might withdraw their favor. Crops would fail, storms would rise. His people would question whether he was truly the divine son of Ra, or merely a man playing a dangerous game with eternity. So, what does a pharaoh do when divinity becomes a burden? When every decision, no matter how mundane, echoes in the halls of heaven and the fields of grain? So the pharaoh wasn't just a man, and not quite a god either. He stood somewhere in between, exalted, scrutinized, celebrated, and suffocated. It's a lonely place to live, especially when your divine identity is managed like a government agency, and your closest advisors are also your greatest liabilities. At the center of this spiritual industrial complex were Egypt's temples, towering, incense-filled monuments of stone. They weren't just places of prayer. They were economic engines, repositories of learning, and centers of political power. Entire cities grew around them. Their priests weren't quaint monks muttering to statues. They were administrators, economists, astronomers, and power brokers. And they expected access. They expected gifts. Most of all, they expected the pharaoh to perform. Pharaohs didn't run the temples directly. That would have been madness. Instead, they appointed high priests, men trained in the intricate rites, hymns, and hieroglyphic formulas required to keep the gods content. But these priests didn't just maintain altars. They oversaw tax collection, temple estates, food, distribution, and artisan guilds. In essence, they functioned like semi-autonomous governors. And if they were displeased, or underfunded, or overshadowed by a pharaoh who seemed too independent, they had ways of pushing back. The pharaoh then found himself in a balancing act. He had to perform rituals that honored the gods, but also flattered the priesthood. He had to bestow lavish gifts to temples without bankrupting the state. And all the while, he had to maintain his image as the source of divine favor, a walking symbol of prosperity. Even when drought, famine, or political unrest told a different story. This tension gave rise to elaborate temple politics. Some pharaohs leaned into one cult over another, favoring Amen in Thebes, for example, while snubbing others like Ptah or Osiris. But favor could shift. A single pharaoh could build one decade's temple, only for his successor to defund it, chisel his name off the walls, and declare a new theological favorite. Such reversals were not rare. They were ritualized, even expected. The gods, or at least their earthly spokespersons, could be fickle. Then came the people, the pharaohs. Divine status wasn't just top. It had to be visible, constant, and participatory. Festivals were one of the most important tools for maintaining this illusion, or perhaps this sacred truth. The Opet festival in Thebes, for instance, was a spectacular affair. Statues of the gods were paraded through the streets. The pharaoh walked, or more likely, was carried alongside, and the whole city partied in a ritualized celebration of divine renewal. These festivals weren't just entertainment. The public expected splendor, offerings, music, free beer. A pharaoh who failed to impress during a festival could seem weak, or worse, cursed. And if the Nile failed to flood, or if locusts destroyed the crops, people didn't blame weather patterns or bad luck. He built more monuments, each more elaborate than the last, filled with carved prayers, begging the gods to send prosperity, fertility, peace. But here's the strange truth. Even while presenting himself as a divine being, the pharaoh lived in fear of losing the favor of gods, priests, or people. Some pharaohs tried to break the cycle. Akhenaten, for example, famously attempted to discard Egypt's pantheon altogether, replacing it with a new religion centered on the Aten, the solar disk. He moved the capital. He closed temples. He declared himself the only true intercessor between God and man. In essence, he tried to privatize divinity, and it failed spectacularly. The people resented the erasure of their familiar gods. Every shrine and letting temples expand their power unchecked, but this too had consequences. By the time of Ramesses XI, the Temple of Ammon was more powerful than the throne itself. The high priest of Ammon controlled armies, collected taxes, and even issued royal decrees. The line between pharaoh and priest blurred, and the balance broke. Divinity, then, was not a status to enjoy. Every illness or misstep could be interpreted as cosmic disfavor. And yet he had to smile, to chant, to raise his arms to the heavens with full certainty that the gods were watching, and that the scribes were taking notes. But what happened behind the walls of power, away from the parades and temple courts? What secrets did the pharaoh keep in the quiet of his private chambers, when no one, not priest nor people, could see him as anything other than a weary man pretending to be divine? By the end of the day, after the festivals faded, the incense thinned, and the last decree was stamped in clay, the pharaoh would retire to his private chambers, or rather, to a space that passed for private. Scribes waited down the hall in case of a sudden thought or command. And yet, in this half-shadowed quiet, a different kind of pharaoh emerged. Not the radiant son of Ra or the voice of Mat, but a man burdened by his own myth. There was no room for vulnerability in public. A pharaoh couldn't grieve, stumble, or age without risking his divine aura, curse a rebellious vassal, or question a priest's whispered ambition. He might even fear the gods he pretended to embody, because while the pharaoh's divinity was preached across Egypt, it was never a two-way channel. The gods did not answer back, not clearly, not reliably. Dreams were interpreted, omens were charted, but doubt always lingered. What if he wasn't chosen? What if he'd failed a sacred rite, mispronounced a prayer, angered a forgotten deity? What if the Nile's poor flood wasn't bad luck, but judgment? No priest could confirm. No oracle could fully soothe the gnawing anxiety of a man responsible for the balance of an entire civilization. It wasn't just spiritual isolation either. Political isolation came with the role. Pharaohs rarely trusted freely. Courtiers vied for influence. Royal wives, often from different noble families or even foreign alliances, brought their own agendas. Half-brothers, sons, or distant cousins might be lurking with ambition just behind the eyes. Even allies were sometimes too loyal, more in love with the image of the divine pharaoh than with the tired, complex human behind it. History is riddled with pharaohs deposed by rivals, overthrown by priests, or erased from records entirely. Tombs desecrated, names chiseled out, whole reigns forgotten until rediscovered centuries later. Divine status was not a guarantee of legacy. It was a tightrope walk across generations, maintained by constant performance, endless stone carving, and a treasury large enough to fund both temples and armies. And still, even with gold and glory, the role often outlasted the man. The pharaoh, after all, was not supposed to be just a man. He was an idea, a bridge, a beacon, a mask of divinity fitted to a fragile human frame. The kingdom might pause when he died, but it didn't stop. The priests prepared for burial. The scribes arranged succession. A new name was carved into A new god-king began the same exhausting dance. In the end, being pharaoh meant living within myth, a life shaped by symbols more than personal desire. Yes, there was power, but it was power bound by ritual, history, expectation, and fear. A cage made not of iron, but of incense and immortality. So the next time you see a golden statue of a pharaoh, eyes fixed forward in timeless serenity, remember this: beneath the kohl-lined gaze and crook-hand flail was a man, perhaps no more certain than you, trying desperately to live up to a legend written long before he was born. If ruling Egypt as a living god was already difficult, doing it while navigating the minefield of royal family dynamics made it even more exhausting. The pharaoh might have been the supreme figure in Egyptian society, but that didn't mean his household was a sanctuary. In fact, managing royal bloodlines was one of the most complicated and uncomfortable duties of the throne, because pharaohs weren't just heads of state. They were breeders of dynasties, protectors of divine lineage, and more awkwardly sometimes husbands to their own sisters. The logic, to Egyptian minds, was sound. If the pharaoh was a god, then his bloodline was sacred. Marrying outside the royal family could dilute that divine spark. So, to keep it pure, pharaohs often married their sisters, half-sisters, or even daughters. It wasn't about love or even desire. It was about political stability and cosmic order. That said, the practical outcomes were often less divine and more dysfunctional. Family, in this context, was less about nurturing and more about positioning. Royal women weren't just wives or mothers, they were titles. The great royal wife was the primary queen, the official consort recognized by the gods and court. But beyond her, there could be dozens of lesser wives, and each of these women had their own networks, ambitions, and sons. Succession, then, was never simple. Egypt didn't follow strict primogeniture like later European monarchies. The heir wasn't always the eldest son, or even a son at all. Instead, a complex mix of birth order, maternal status, priestly support, and military backing shaped who wore the double crown next. Sometimes the heir was groomed from youth. Other times, he emerged from a palace power struggle that only historians could untangle centuries later. Even worse, the pharaoh might have multiple sons from different wives, each backed by different factions in the palace. Infighting wasn't just possible, it was common. There were whispers, plots, even assassinations. More than one pharaoh's death was followed by a suspiciously short mourning period, and an equally suspicious rise of a rival claimant. And what of the royal daughters? They weren't sidelined, far from it. In some cases, they were married to their own brothers to cement alliances. In rare cases, they rose to power themselves. Most famously, Hatshepsut, a royal daughter and wife of a pharaoh, became pharaoh in her own right. She wore the false beard, took on the full titulary, and ruled for over 2 decades, one of Egypt's most stable and prosperous periods. Yet even she faced opposition, and after her death, later rulers tried to erase her legacy, chiseling her name off monuments, as if the idea of a woman pharaoh was just too dangerous to remember. Inside the palace, motherhood was as much a political role as it was a familial one. The queen who bore the future pharaoh wielded immense influence, often acting as advisor, regent, or spiritual guide. But this influence was fragile. If her son died or was passed over, her power evaporated. And because royal births were sacred, midwives and physicians working in the palace had to follow strict rituals and maintain absolute secrecy. Even a whisper of an illegitimate heir could destabilize the kingdom. Raising royal children was its own challenge. Sons were taught hieroglyphs, ritual duties, and sometimes even military training from an early age. But their futures were never guaranteed. The child playing with a carved lion one day could be exiled the next if court politics turned. Royal favor was currency, and even a prince had to earn it, or at least not lose it. And through it all, the pharaoh himself, this living god surrounded by incense and obligation, had to keep the whole machine running. He had to reward loyalty without empowering rivals, elevate wives without breeding resentment, and prepare a successor while still appearing immortal. It was a tightrope walk over a pit of serpents, some of whom shared his blood. So what happened when no clear heir existed, or worse, when too many claimed the right to rule? How did Egypt, so obsessed with divine order, handle the messy reality of human ambition? Succession in ancient Egypt was not an elegant handing over of power. It was a ritualized scramble, wrapped in golden robes and sharp elbows. For all the divine language around pharaohs being eternal, everyone in the palace knew the truth. The god-king was mortal, and the throne didn't wait long to be claimed once he died, or even before, when a pharaoh passed away, whether by illness, old age, or in some suspicious cases, too conveniently, the process of succession kicked into motion, like a chariot wheel rolling down a sand dune, quickly, loudly, and without breaks. Ideally, there would be a clear heir, a son born to the great royal wife, already trained in ritual duties, respected by the priesthood, and poised to ascend. But ideally was not always reality. Sometimes the heir was still a child. Sometimes he had died years earlier in battle, or from illness, or from a fall down the wrong flight of palace steps, which may or may not have been an accident. And sometimes there were 2 or 3 or 4 sons, all with plausible claims. Some were sons of powerful secondary wives. Some had military support. Some were backed by the priesthood. All of them, in their own way, saw themselves as pharaoh material. When this happened, Egypt turned to what it did best: ritualized chaos. In theory, the pharaoh's successor had to be confirmed through religious ceremonies, often at Karnak or another major temple, where the high priests of Amun or Ptah would bless the new ruler and declare him the divine embodiment of Horus. But if there were disputes, that ceremony might be delayed, contested, or repeated with different candidates. There are records of overlapping reigns, contradictory dates, even pharaohs whose names were erased mid-carving, only to be replaced with another after a sudden correction. Military commanders played a critical role in these transitions. A general with enough troops could enforce a claim, even if the priesthood hesitated. Conversely, a candidate favored by the temples might be installed without a strong army, relying instead on divine legitimacy and bureaucratic loyalty. Neither path was smooth. Both often ended in accusations, intrigue, and the sudden death of rivals by sword, poison, or exile. And yet, public calm had to be maintained. Egypt's cosmic worldview couldn't tolerate obvious instability. The idea of balance, harmony, the natural order was sacred. So succession crises were papered over with elegant inscriptions, revised dates, and recarved monuments. You wouldn't know from most surviving records that the transition was bloody or contested unless you knew what to look for. Chisel marks where names were erased, sudden gaps in timelines, or tombs left unfinished because a prince died before he could finish building his own eternity. In times of extreme uncertainty, a queen mother might step in. These royal matriarchs, often behind the scenes during their husband's reign, sometimes emerged as regents. Their role wasn't just ceremonial. They wielded real power, managing state affairs, calming court factions, and preparing the child. Pharaoh for rule. Some were deeply respected, others were feared. A few disappeared mysteriously just when their influence peaked. In rarer cases, a high-ranking general might seize power outright. Such was the fate of Horemheb, who rose to power. After the chaotic end of Akhenaten's lineage and the brief, ill-fated reign of Tutankhamun, Horemheb was not royal by birth, but with enough military backing and a politically convenient marriage, he assumed the throne and declared the previous kings nullified, erasing them from official records, like editing a mistake from a holy manuscript. But the real challenge wasn't just getting the crown, it was keeping it. Even a newly crowned pharaoh had to immediately assert dominance, reshuffle the court, confirm temple alliances, and begin massive building projects to cement his legacy, both politically and spiritually. And above all, he had two father sons. Quickly, because Egypt's divine monarchy only worked if someone was ready to inherit. Otherwise, the cycle of uncertainty would start all over again, dragging the gods, the people, and the delicate balance of the empire back into dangerous limbo. So what did all of this mean for the women behind the throne, the queens, daughters, and sisters caught in the dynastic storm? Were they mere pawns in the succession game, or something more powerful, more dangerous, more quietly decisive? If you judged the role of royal women in ancient Egypt only by public monuments, you might assume they lived in the background, draped in linen, offering flowers, smiling eternally beside their husband, pharaohs. But behind the pillars and papyrus scrolls, queens and princesses were far more than decorative. In fact, they often shaped the throne more than the kings themselves. At the top of this silent power structure stood the great royal wife, the chief queen, whose job wasn't merely to adorn the throne, but to legitimize it. Her marriage bound divine bloodlines together, and her womb was expected to produce heirs, ideally male, of course, but politically savvy queens knew that even daughters could shape dynasties. Her name was often carved next to the king's on temple walls, her titles echoing her status: wife of the god, mistress of the two lands, mother of the king. But titles only told part of the story. These queens wielded real influence in court politics. They advised their husbands, formed alliances with priests, and negotiated with scribes and generals. Some acted as regents for underage sons, effectively ruling the kingdom themselves. Others acted behind the scenes, carefully maneuvering the succession game by promoting the claims of their children over rival heirs. Consider Tai, wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten. She was neither born royal nor Egyptian, yet she rose to immense power, appearing beside her husband in inscriptions as an equal and continuing to advise her son long after her husband's death. She wasn't a silent queen, she was a strategist, a diplomat, and perhaps even a key voice behind her son's revolutionary religious reforms. And then there were the princess bride's daughters, married to their own brothers or fathers to reinforce dynastic purity. Their lives were more ceremonial than maternal. Some gave birth to pharaohs, others faded into anonymity. A few, like Mutnajmet or Meritatan, left just enough of a paper trail to hint at power, but not enough to tell us where it began or ended. Still, they were essential gears in the dynastic machinery, not loved for who they were, but needed for what they represented. The most extraordinary case, of course, remains Hatshepsut, officially the god's wife of Amun and regent. For her stepson, Thutmose III, she made the boldest move of any royal woman in Egyptian history. She declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, not consort, but pharaoh. She adopted the full titulary, wore the royal beard, and built monumental temples celebrating her reign. For over 20 years, she ruled with authority, expanding trade networks, constructing vast temples, and reshaping Egypt's image of power. And yet, after her death, her stepson tried to erase her legacy, defacing statues, carving over inscriptions, and reasserting male dominance over the throne. Why the erasure? Because her rule, while successful, disrupted the delicate fiction of maidenly pharaohs. Her existence proved that women could rule, could thrive, could build, and that terrified the fragile, patriarchal veneer of Egypt's mythology. Even the so-called minor queens, the concubines and kings' wives, played roles in the power structure. Their children might become claimants to the throne. Their fathers or brothers might be generals, priests, or foreign kings, and their marriages could be diplomatic chess moves. Egypt never had queens in the modern sense, but it had kingmakers, kingbreakers, and, in rare but striking cases, kings in all but name, and through all of it, the incense, smoke, the ritual offerings, the bloodline calculations, these women walked tightropes just as treacherous as the men. One misstep could mean exile. One alliance could determine the next dynasty. And yet, they smiled in stone, forever elegant, forever composed, because, in the end, the divine throne of Egypt was never balanced on the shoulders of Pharaoh alone. It was propped up by mothers whispering advice, wives playing politics, and daughters whose names, when allowed to survive the chisel, told stories of strength behind every crown. When you picture the dining table of a pharaoh, what comes to mind? Silver goblets, steaming plates of roast meats, honey-glazed delicacies, and an army of servants unveiling fragrant platters beneath golden lids. That's what the imagery suggests: opulence, excess, divinely ordained indulgence. But the reality was much grainier. Literally, the foundation of a pharaoh's diet, like that of his poorest subject, was bread and beer, two staples so central to Egyptian life they were considered sacred offerings to the gods, wages for laborers, and acceptable funeral gifts. No matter how lofty your status, no matter how many cartouches bore your name, if you were Egyptian, you ate bread, often made with sand. The problem wasn't poverty. The pharaoh had the best ingredients, the finest bakers, and access to wheat and emmer that most couldn't dream of. But Egypt's milling technology, though clever, was rough. Grain was ground using stone querns, and fine grit from those stones often ended up in the flour. The result? Bread that could slowly grind down teeth, even for the King of Kings. Mummies of royal Egyptians frequently show worn molars and jaw inflammation, signs that even in the palace, one chewed with caution. Still, the bread itself could be elaborate. Royal bakers prepared dozens of varieties: honey-sweetened loaves, sesame-studded buns, date-filled rolls, and even breads shaped like animals or symbols for ritual offerings. Bread wasn't just food, it was art, religion, and accounting all at once. Temples recorded grain deliveries and bread production with bureaucratic precision. Some loaves were used only in sacred rites, others were placed in tombs, untouched, for the journey to the afterlife. Beer, the other pillar of the royal table, was a frothy, murky affair, more porridge than pilsner. It was brewed from partially baked loaves mixed with water and fermented in clay jars. Pharaohs drank it daily, but not in golden goblets. It was scooped, strained, and sometimes flavored with herbs or dates. It was nutritious, mildly alcoholic, and essential. Beer was not a luxury. It was liquid bread, hydrating and sustaining. In the desert heat, so far, the royal diet sounds humble. But make no mistake, pharaohs had access to more than just carbs and brew. They enjoyed meat, although not with every meal. Cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered during festivals or ceremonies. The more luxurious meats, like duck, goose, and antelope, were reserved for banquets or offerings to the gods. Pharaohs often took the godly portion for themselves, either physically or symbolically. Fruits like figs, grapes, and dates provided sweetness, while garlic, onions, and leeks added flavor and possibly body odor. Honey, rare and precious, was used sparingly. Salt and spices were imported luxuries, hoarded and used in ways that signaled status. Prayers were recited. Certain foods were eaten only on certain days, depending on the alignment of the stars and the temple's calendars. But pharaohs didn't eat alone. Meals were performances, attended by wives, sons, scribes, priests, tasters, and even royal musicians. The food might be simple, but the setting reminded everyone this was not an ordinary meal. It was a sacred act, the body of a god sustaining itself. And yet, even gods had digestion. Behind the velvet curtains and perfumed courtyards, pharaohs faced the same mundane realities of the body. There are records of digestive tonics, laxatives, and medicinal enemas. Royal physicians prescribe diets to correct imbalances, sometimes more symbolic than scientific, but taken very seriously. Eating, after all, had consequences, not just for health, but for afterlife readiness. Overindulgence was frowned upon. Impurity in the gut was thought to corrupt the spirit, so when the pharaoh sat down to eat, whether it was a holy loaf with sacred beer or a roasted goose stuffed with dates, he wasn't just dining, he was performing harmony, maintaining cosmic balance, aligning body, soul, and state in every bite. But what happened when food went bad? When sacred supplies spoiled or pests infested the storerooms? In a land where divine order was supposed to be reflected in every detail, how did pharaohs deal with the unpleasant and very human problem of rot? It's easy to forget, amid the gold and granite of ancient Egypt's grandeur, that food, even sacred food, spoiled. The Nile's bounty fed millions, but it also brought mold, insects, and heat that turned honeyed dates into shriveled husks and bread into sour bricks within days. And no amount of divine authority could keep a basket of figs from fermenting under the wrong sun. Even pharaohs, gods though they were, had to contend with the smells of rot, the buzz of flies, and the quiet embarrassment of sour beer served in a golden jar. The problem wasn't supply. Egypt's granaries were often full, the Nile generous. In most years, the problem was storage. Most royal food was kept in red baskets, clay jars, or mud brick silos. They weren't immune to Egypt's relentless climate or its many pests. Weevils, in particular, were common tiny beetles that burrowed into barley or wheat, leaving a powdery mess and a panicked kitchen staff. There are even records of pharaohs ordering inspections of grain stores, demanding purges of spoiled food, and issuing directives to temple staff about hygiene. The palace staff took spoilage seriously. Priests in the royal kitchens followed purification rituals as strict as any temple rite. Before preparing food for the pharaoh, they washed in sacred waters, burned incense, and uttered invocations to ward off contamination, both physical and spiritual. Even the act of stirring a pot could require a prayer. But despite all the chanting and scrubbing, meat still went bad, especially during feast days when vast quantities were butchered, cooked, and offered up in the sun before being consumed. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes those offerings were retrieved and eaten. Ancient Egyptian texts mention the practice of reversion of offerings, the idea that food dedicated to the gods, once blessed, could be reclaimed and consumed by priests and royal officials. In theory, this was spiritually safe. The food was made pure through divine contact, but in practice, some of these offerings sat for hours, sometimes a full day, in the heat before being passed back to the human realm. Pharaohs, especially the more devout, partook in these rites, eating meat or bread that had been placed before statues of gods, then returned for human consumption. It was sacred, it was symbolic, it was occasionally nauseating. Manage spoilage. Palaces developed systems of rotational storage. Grain and produce were labeled, dated, and regularly inspected. Scribes recorded everything: how many loaves were baked, how many went to offerings, how many returned, and how many were discarded. This wasn't generosity, it was necessity. Bad food could ruin rituals, spread disease, or worse, offend the gods. The pharaoh couldn't be seen gagging during a feast in honor of Osiris. The mummified remains of several royals show signs of parasites, dental abscesses, and intestinal distress. Whether from spoiled food, unfiltered water, or sheer excess, digestion was a concern. Royal physicians offered remedies ranging from garlic poultices and honey mixtures to more dubious cures: crocodile dung, anyone, all intended to restore balance. Because health, in the Egyptian worldview, wasn't just physical. A pharaoh's upset stomach might reflect spiritual imbalance, political unrest, or a failure to honor the gods properly. And yet, amidst all this rot and ritual, one food item held a strangely central and often problematic place in the royal diet. Fish. Fish were plentiful, delicious, and easy to prepare, but they were also theologically suspicious. Certain fish, especially catfish and eel, were considered unclean or taboo in specific regions. In Memphis, priests of Petaband their consumption entirely. In other cities, they were eaten with ceremony and caution. The pharaoh had to navigate these rules carefully. A wrong bite at the wrong banquet could offend a local deity, anger a priesthood, or trigger a superstitious backlash. Fish could also spoil faster than anything else in the royal kitchen. Packed in salt or dried in the sun, it was sometimes edible for days, but often not. A pharaoh known for favoring fish might also be remembered for public bouts of indigestion. Even offerings to the gods were sometimes made of clay models of fish rather than the real thing, simply to avoid the risk of rot. The symbolism mattered more than the substance. Still, pharaohs, like anyone, had cravings. They indulged in sweetmeats, cheese, beer, stronger than the temple allowed, but they had to do it discreetly. Gluttony was a sin against Mat. Moderation was divine, and so indulgence had to be cloaked in ritual, hidden behind holy language, or excused as necessary nourishment for the burdens of kingship. But the longer a pharaoh ruled, the more his diet became not just a reflection of status, but a sign of age, health, and legacy. So what happened when that royal appetite began to fade? When meals became smaller, the digestion slower, and the physicians more frequent? What did it mean for a divine king to grow weak, not in battle, but at the table? For a young pharaoh, food was both a ritual and a reward, a symbol of vitality, abundance, and divine favor. But as age crept in, the royal diet often became a reminder of the body's decline. Once-craved dishes now upset the stomach. Lavish feasts felt heavier, and physicians, once called in for symbolic blessings, became permanent fixtures at court, measuring pulses, inspecting stools, and whispering nervously about humors, heat, and imbalance. The pharaoh was still divine, of course. The cartouches still bore his name. The priests still sang of his strength and eternal youth. But within the cool shade of palace dining rooms, reality gnawed at the edges. Eating became less about pleasure and more about control of symptoms, of aging, of appearances. Royal kitchens adapted. Meals became blander, softer, easier to chew and digest. Hardened bread gave way to porridges. Meat was boiled into broths. Sweetness came from dates and honey, but in small quantities, too much, and the pharaoh might suffer faintness or swelling. Even beer, once so central to the diet, was sometimes replaced with herbal tonics or filtered water steeped in lotus leaves and fig skin. It wasn't about taste anymore. It was about preservation. And then came the rituals of health. Meals laced with medicinal herbs, roots crushed and stirred into stews. Garlic and onions were eaten not just for flavor, but for their supposed protective qualities. Honey, considered both food and medicine, was spread on bread or dissolved in hot infusions. The pharaoh's physicians, often priest-healers trained in temple scrolls, prescribed these ingredients with grave ceremony, citing scrolls from Imhotep's time, invoking deities like Sekhmet for healing, and recording every change in appetite, as though the fate of the Nile depended on it. But all their incantations couldn't stop time. Some pharaohs, in their final years, dined in increasing solitude. Meals were taken in private, with only a physician and a food taster present. Court protocol remained intact, but the grandeur faded. The throne might still be draped in linen and lapis, but the man upon it grew thinner, slower, quieter. No one dared speak of decline openly. That would be blasphemy. But within the palace walls, everyone noticed when the pharaoh began eating less, and yet meals retained their cosmic weight. Even a single mouthful of bread, taken with a prayer, was a reaffirmation of Mat. A simple stew, shared with a scribe, might be part of a ritual to restore balance. Food had always been more than sustenance in Egypt. It was theology, politics, and performance, a mirror of the body and the kingdom. As the pharaoh's appetite waned, another kind of preparation began. The tomb planners came more often. The temple scribes began composing funeral offerings. Special loaves were ordered, not for consumption, but for burial. They were molded to last, infused with preservatives, and sealed with sacred prayers. Clay jars were filled with wine and oil, labeled with the pharaoh's name, and stacked for eternity. His favorite dishes, or at least symbolic versions, were recreated as tomb models, ready for service in the afterlife. There was no illusion about mortality. Pharaohs knew they would die, but they believed or hoped that eating the right foods in the right ways with the right rituals would ensure a better next life. A life where bread never staled, beer never soured, and fish never rotted in the sun. Some tomb inscriptions even describe what the pharaoh wanted to eat forever. Figs, pomegranates, roast goose, honey cakes. Others were more modest, just a daily loaf and a jug of cool water. In the afterlife, even the gods were served by staff, and pharaohs, if properly buried, would be among them, ruling in miniature, feasting eternally. And so the kitchen fires burned quietly long after the pharaoh could no longer eat. Offerings were made, recipes were recorded. Bread was baked not for breakfast, but for immortality, because in the end, a pharaoh's legacy wasn't just built with stone and law. It was kneaded into dough, fermented in jars, and carved into clay models of duck-shaped loaves. Even gods, it turns out, are remembered by what they left on the table. You'd think a pharaoh, with access to gold, servants, and the blessings of the gods, would have led a clean and comfortable life. But in ancient Egypt, cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was about cosmic order. To be clean was to be aligned with Mat, the divine principle of balance. To be unclean was not just unhygienic, it was dangerous, spiritually, disruptive, even politically risky. And so, pharaohs scrubbed, daily, ritualistically, sometimes obsessively, bathing. For the average Egyptian, often meant a quick rinse from a clay jar or a dip in a canal. But for the pharaoh, it was a sacred event, conducted with all the solemnity of a royal decree. He didn't wash himself. Of course, that was the job of specialized attendants, often priests, trained not only in hygiene, but in theology. You weren't just cleaning the king, you were purifying the living embodiment of Horus. Each morning began with a full-body cleansing, sometimes before dawn, using water that had been blessed and left to sit in the moonlight. The attendants would pour it slowly, chanting invocations to cleanse both body and spirit. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist, but natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, was used as a cleanser and deodorizer. It was effective, though harsh. Some pharaohs reportedly had dry, cracked skin from years of scrubbing with alkaline salts. Divine flesh, it turns out, required exfoliation. After bathing, the pharaoh was anointed with oils. This wasn't just skincare, though it helped. protect the skin from Egypt's harsh sun. Each oil had symbolic meaning. Myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and cedar were applied in specific orders on specific body parts, each tied to a deity or sacred function. Lotus oil for divine rebirth, myrrh for protection, frankincense for spiritual elevation. The pharaoh didn't just smell expensive, he was a walking altar, and the scent mattered strongly. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with smell. A pleasant aroma indicated purity, health, and divine favor. A foul odor, that was the stink of decay, chaos, and the underworld. Pharaohs were known to wear wax cones infused with perfume atop their wigs, which melted slowly throughout the day, releasing fragrance. These cones were both cosmetic and symbolic. The slow melting represented spiritual transformation. But even with all the perfumes, there was sweat. Egypt is hot, and the pharaoh's regalia, the layered kilts, golden collars, heavy wigs, didn't exactly breathe. And while commoners could strip 2 loincloths in the fields, the pharaoh had appearances to maintain. He could not be seen sweating like a peasant, so he was carefully dried with linen cloths, fanned by servants, and refreshed with scented water between ceremonies. Some wore thin undergarments of imported linen, designed to absorb moisture without disrupting the look of sacred dress. Even foot hygiene was ritualized. Sandals were removed and cleaned daily. The pharaoh's feet were often washed by servants, or even high priests, a symbolic act of humility and reverence. Certain festivals required the pharaoh to walk barefoot in temples, so extra care was taken to soften the soles with oils and scrubs made from crushed pumice or date pits, and hair that was usually removed. Pharaohs, like most elites, shaved their heads. Hair was considered unclean, a magnet for lice and impurity. Instead, wigs were worn, elaborate constructions of human hair, plant fibers, or even gold threads. These wigs were maintained by their own attendants, washed in palm wine and cedar oil, styled, and stored in boxes that rivaled the size of modern closets. But there was a darker side to this obsession with purity. It created anxiety. The slightest blemish, boil, or rash could be seen as a sign of divine disfavor. Some pharaohs had personal physicians dedicated solely to monitoring skin health. Priests conducted rituals to drive out invisible forces believed to cause disease. Offerings were made, spells recited, oils were blessed, because cleanliness wasn't about germ theory, it was about harmony. And if a pharaoh appeared unclean, the entire kingdom might suffer. So the morning scrub was just the beginning. Throughout the day, the pharaoh might repurify before rituals, after touching certain objects, or upon hearing bad omens. Water was always at hand. So were oils, linen, incense, and priests with sharp eyes and endless scrolls of ritual instructions. But what about illness? If cleanliness was tied to spiritual balance, then sickness meant something had gone wrong, cosmically. And when the god-king caught a fever or broke out in pustules, it wasn't just a health crisis. It was a crisis of faith to the outside world. The pharaoh was flawless, a divine being in human form, untouched by age, impurity, or frailty. But behind the incense, smoke, and alabaster smiles, even a god-king could catch a cold. And when he did, it wasn't just the concern of court physicians. It was a theological emergency. If the pharaoh, the living vessel of Horus, became ill, what did that say about the health of the cosmos. Illness wasn't interpreted as biological misfortune. It was often seen as spiritual imbalance or divine punishment. The gods were believed to communicate through the body, and any ailment was a message. A sore throat might be a warning from Thoth. Swelling in the limbs could signal the wrath of Sekhmet. A rash, perhaps a bad omen from a neglected household deity. The pharaoh didn't just feel unwell, he became the subject of urgent religious decoding. The royal court maintained teams of physicians, many of whom were also priests. Medicine in ancient Egypt was deeply entwined with religion. Diagnoses were made using both observation and incantation. There were scrolls, medical papyri, filled with thousands of treatments. What herbs to use, what words to speak, what god to invoke. A pharaoh's treatment was always dual, physical and magical, and the treatments were eclectic. A pharaoh with stomach troubles might receive a poultice of mashed garlic and cumin, or a dose of castor oil mixed with dates and honey. Constipation, crushed sycamore fig mixed with beer. A toothache could be treated with dried mousetail, powdered, of course, and carefully wrapped in linen. Many of these cures came with spells, chanted rhythmically as the mixture was applied. The incantation was not optional. The treatment wasn't considered effective until the right words had been spoken by the right mouth. More serious ailments required more serious rituals. The priest of Sekhmet, goddess of both healing and destruction, might be summoned to perform a driving out of demons ceremony, a dramatic affair involving fire, incense, chants, and sometimes offerings of raw meat. The pharaoh would be ritually cleansed again, anointed, and perhaps secluded for several days, not for rest, but for isolation. His impurity was believed to ripple outward, affecting those around him, even the land itself. And it wasn't just internal illness that caused alarm. Any visible affliction, boils, rashes, swelling, posed a danger to the pharaoh's image. Remember, this was a man who appeared in public as a god. If he looked ill, the people might question his divine favor. So makeup was thickened, wigs were adjusted. In extreme cases, statues of the pharaoh were paraded instead of the man himself, with priests explaining that the living god was meditating or in communion with the divine. One documented case hints at such substitution. A pharaoh whose failing health forced him to avoid public rituals for nearly a year. In his place, his ka, his spiritual double, often represented by statues or reliefs, was venerated in elaborate ceremonies. The illusion of continuity was preserved, even as the man himself recovered behind closed doors. Of course, not all illnesses passed. Some pharaohs died suddenly, their symptoms unrecorded, their causes shrouded in mystery. And when that happened, a different kind of ritual began. Priests scrambled to reinterpret signs. Was it a misstep in the last festival, a neglected temple, a rival's curse? The idea that a pharaoh could simply get sick and die of natural causes was hard to reconcile. The divine couldn't just fail, so they rewrote the ending in temple texts. The pharaoh's illness became a sacred transition, his suffering a test by the gods, his death a passage into eternal kingship, ruling beside Osiris in the field of reeds. But even so, the failure to remain perfectly clean, healthy, and whole in life cast a long shadow. Some rulers were remembered less for their achievements and more for their visible decline, their withdrawn appearances, their trembling hands, their swollen joints glimpsed through linen and through it all. The rituals of cleanliness continued, the daily scrubbings, the oilings, the incense wafting through the palace. These acts weren't just for comfort, they were armor against disorder, a defense against the reality that even the divine sweated, ached, and sometimes faltered. But what did the pharaoh do when his body failed but his rule continued? How did a god-king manage the burden of visibility, the need to seem strong while feeling anything but? The pharaoh's body was supposed to be eternal, a vessel blessed by the gods, sustained by ritual, and polished daily to a sacred sheen. But as age crept in and illness refused to retreat, even the most radiant of kings began to wear down. And unlike a lowly scribe who could retreat quietly to his bed, the pharaoh had to keep showing up, keep appearing, keep being divine, even when the gods inside him felt very far away. There were strategies, of course. Royal optics mattered as much as royal decrees. In later years, some pharaohs rarely appeared in public without layers of cosmetics and regalia to hide tremors, discoloration, or frailty. Kohl was applied more generously to weary eyes. Wigs were restyled to disguise hair loss or thinning brows. Gold collars and elaborate scepters gave the illusion of weight and strength. The pharaoh was sometimes carried instead of walking, seated atop gilded litters, as if floating effortlessly, a practical necessity, reframed as divine detachment. But behind the shimmering illusion, there was management. Entire teams were assigned to ensure the pharaoh looked vigorous, not just in person, but in art. Statues and reliefs depicted him forever youthful, upright, victorious. In truth, he may have required help climbing stairs, or had his speeches whispered to him by court attendants. Yet the records were sculpted to hide all of it. The god must not be seen limping inside the palace. The rituals of cleanliness intensified. Baths became more frequent, more medicinal. Ointments were thickened with herbal compounds to treat stiffness and pain. Massages, once symbolic acts of anointment, became practical treatments for aching joints. And every touch, every application, was framed in the language of divine rejuvenation. Even as the body beneath grew weaker, some pharaohs turned inward. They spent more time in chapels, performing purification rites, not just for Egypt, but for themselves. These weren't acts of vanity, they were gestures of cosmic reassurance. As long as the pharaoh could still make offerings, chant invocations, and participate in temple ceremonies, even from a chair, the illusion of harmony held. But sometimes, the burden became too much to bear. In rare cases, co-regency was declared. A living pharaoh might appoint his son or successor to rule alongside him. This was not abdication. It was presented as divine multiplication, 2 bodies, 1 royal soul. In reality, it was often a way for an aging king to retreat from public life without shaking the stability of the state. His heir would take on more duties while the elder king remained in ceremonial prominence, his presence sustained through statues, inscriptions, and ritual stand-ins. And yet, there was always the fear of being forgotten. What if the kingdom moved on too quickly? What if his name faded faster than his body? Pharaohs, despite all their grandeur, were deeply anxious about legacy. That's why their tombs were massive, why their cartouches were chiseled 1,000 times. why their names were sung daily in temples, because to be remembered was to be eternal. To be forgotten was worse than death. As their strength faded, some pharaohs focused entirely on their afterlife hygiene. They met with embalmers, consulted with priests on burial spells, reviewed lists of oils and resins for mummification. Every detail mattered. The body had to be perfectly preserved, not just physically, but spiritually. The right amulets, the right jars, the right blessings, because the pharaoh's final bath would not be with water, but with natron and prayer, and still, in their last days, they might continue rituals, not because they had to, but because they feared what might happen if they stopped. The kingdom, after all, reflected its king. If the pharaoh ceased to wash, to anoint, to purify, might the Nile fail? Might the temples crumble? Might the gods turn their faces? So the scrubbing continued, the oils flowed, and when the pharaoh finally closed his eyes for the last time, he was wrapped not just in linen, but in centuries of cleanliness, a lifetime of sacred sweat, perfumed breath, and whispered invocations. To stay whole, stay sacred, stay remembered, because in Egypt, even divine decay had to be immaculate. The pharaoh's bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a chamber of state, a temple of intimacy, and often a battlefield of symbolism. In ancient Egypt, where every corner of life was soaked in ritual, even something as private as where a king laid his head at night was shaped by politics, magic, and celestial expectation. A royal bedchamber might look luxurious, gilded wooden frames, carved headrests, soft linens imported from the finest looms, but its function was more than comfort. It was where heirs were made, where omens were received, and where protection against chaos had to be actively maintained. Sleep was never simply rest. It was vulnerability. And for a pharaoh, being vulnerable, even in dreams, was dangerous. The room itself was carefully designed. It often aligned with celestial patterns, facing north toward the circumpolar stars, or built atop sacred foundations, meant to repel dark forces. Symbols of protection surrounded the chamber, images of Hathor for love, Base for fertility, and Toret to guard against nightmares. Amulets were sewn into cushions, spells were painted on walls. Incense was burned before sleep, not for relaxation, but to purify the air and ward off unseen spirits. And the pharaoh rarely slept alone. The great royal wife had her own chamber, but conjugal visits were ritual events, scheduled and supervised, sometimes even noted by scribes. The goal, more than romance, it was dynastic continuity. A successful union meant potential heirs. And because conception was tied to divine favor, the act itself was, in many ways, a ritual offering to the gods. This isn't to say love didn't exist in the palace, but it was layered under expectation. If a pharaoh favored one wife or concubine too openly, court tensions flared. Every bedmate carried political implications. Was she of noble birth? Was she from a foreign land, a treaty bride? Did her child now have a claim to the throne? Jealousy wasn't just personal, it was structural. Then there were the magic spells to guard the pharaoh during the night. Royal magicians provided charms and incantations meant to protect against demons, venomous animals, and bad dreams. Dreams, after all, were messages from the gods or warnings from hostile spirits. A pharaoh, who dreamt of drowning, being bitten, or walking through shadow, might wake to find his day filled with counter-rituals. Dream interpreters, trained in ancient books of symbols, were part of the royal household. A bad dream could delay a ceremony, cancel a journey, or even trigger a temple sacrifice. And yet, despite the magic, the incense, and the spells, the pharaoh still had trouble sleeping. How could he not? His days were filled with ritual obligations, political decisions, endless ceremonies, and always the fear of misstep. Even in bed, he was not free. He lay beneath a carved canopy decorated with stars and deities, meant to remind him of the heavens above, but it was a nightly reminder to "you are watched." Always. Some pharaohs developed insomnia rituals, gentle prayers recited until sleep came, or lullaby-like hymns performed by female musicians stationed near the royal chamber. Others took herbal remedies, blue lotus steeped in wine, poppy-based pastes applied to the temples. Whether these were effective or merely symbolic is unclear. But for a god-king, even a sleeping draft needed the blessing of a priest, and if the pharaoh woke in the night, it wasn't always for water. Sometimes he'd summon a scribe to record a dream. Sometimes he'd ask for a priest to reconsecrate the room. In extreme cases, the bed itself would be dismantled, its components ritually cleansed and reassembled to erase any lingering taint of bad omens, because to sleep poorly was to risk ruling poorly. But what happened when the pharaoh's sleep was interrupted not by dreams or demons, but by political whispers, midnight messages, suspicious footsteps, secrets passed between servants? What shadows walked the royal halls when even the gods were quiet? For all its sacred incense and scented oils, the royal bedchamber could be a very lonely place. The pharaoh might have been surrounded by luxury, but luxury had ears, and not always friendly ones. Behind the carved cedar doors and perfumed linen lay a truth whispered in palace corridors. Nighttime was the kingdom's most dangerous hour. A pharaoh was never truly alone, even in sleep. The chamber walls were thick, but not impenetrable. Attendants waited in the next room. Guards rotated just outside the doors. Trusted concubines were allowed to stay close. But trust in a royal court was a fragile thing, easily bent, quickly broken. The very people meant to protect the pharaoh could become agents of conspiracy, and history proves that midnight messages were as potent as any official decree. There are records scattered, indirect, chiseled in careful vagueness, that suggests more than one pharaoh met his end under suspicious circumstances. A whispered plot, a poisoned drink, a servant who didn't return. The bedchamber, so carefully guarded with ritual magic, was still vulnerable to human ambition. Even gods, it seems, had to worry about pillowside politics, and the pharaoh knew this. That's why he often slept with a dagger beneath his pillow, blessed by priests, wrapped in protective spells. It wasn't just symbolic, it was insurance. He may have ruled as Horus, the falcon-eyed protector, but in the dark, he was just a man, mortal, aging, surrounded by people who benefited from his fall. Assassinations were rare, yes, but never impossible. Some never even left a trace. No wound, no blood. Just a pharaoh who didn't wake up, and a court too disciplined to ask why. This reality made nighttime rituals of protection even more elaborate. Priests might draw invisible lines of power around the chamber, invoking the gods to seal out malevolent forces. Special amulets, tiny, powerful, sacred, were hidden in the corners of the room, under cushions, inside wall niches, not for decoration, for defense. Some were shaped like cobras, ready to strike unseen enemies. Others bore the eye of Horus, to keep spiritual and physical intruders at bay. And yet, the most unsettling enemy was often not physical. It was the mind. Bore the weight of an empire, taxes, borders, floods, temples, heirs. All that pressure didn't disappear at night. If anything, it grew heavier in silence. There was no throne to sit upon in the dark, no crowds to cheer, no priests to flatter, just questions. Was my decree just? Did my general lie to me? Does the high priest speak the will of the gods, or his own? Insomnia became common. Some pharaohs paced through night gardens, barefoot and silent, guarded by a single torchbearer. Others requested midnight readings of sacred texts, hoping that hearing the words of Ra or Thoth would soothe them into sleep. One curious record describes a pharaoh who demanded that royal musicians play the same hymn 12 times in a row each night, believing the repetition would silence his mind. But even when sleep finally came, it wasn't always peaceful. Dreams so vital to the Egyptian worldview could destabilize a ruler. A dream of a falling star, a bleeding lion, or a cracked ankh could send priests into urgent action. Spells were recited. Offerings were made. The pharaoh's bedding might be burned and replaced, just in case the bad dream had soaked into the linens. And then there were visits. Not all who entered the pharaoh's chamber came with malice. Some came with messages, urgent reports from the border, omens spotted by astronomers, petitions from the priesthood. These messengers were let in through side doors, escorted by trusted guards, speaking in hushed tones, while the pharaoh rubbed sleep from his eyes and weighed the fate of cities. Decisions were made in these twilight hours. Some were wise, some were rash. All were recorded by sleepless scribes just outside the curtain. But sometimes the interruptions came not from the outside world, but from the pharaoh himself. In the middle of the night, he might rise and speak to no one, walk barefoot to the window and gaze at the stars. Ask aloud whether the gods still heard him, whether they approved, whether beneath all the rituals and offerings and ceremonies he was truly divine, or just pretending like everyone else. And in those quiet, vulnerable moments, the royal bedchamber became what it truly was, not a symbol of luxury, but a cage of expectation. Every thread of linen, every amulet under the pillow, every ritual chant before sleep, all meant to protect a man from the terrifying possibility that the divine silence meant something had gone wrong. But what happened when the pharaoh's fear wasn't of enemies or illness, but of being alone? What happened when even the most sacred bed in Egypt couldn't keep away the emptiness of all the burdens a pharaoh carried? Divine status, military command, priestly expectations, the one most rarely carved into stone, was perhaps the most human: loneliness. Surrounded by servants, priests, advisors, and wives, a pharaoh was never physically alone. Yet few men in history lived so completely isolated in their identity, their role, their myth. And nowhere did that isolation echo more quietly than in the royal bedchamber. Every surface in the pharaoh's sleeping quarters was curated for symbolism. The lotus-shaped headrests, the celestial motifs stitched into the linens, the protective deities etched into the bedposts. Even the placement of the bed mattered, often aligned with cardinal directions or celestial bodies, to ensure the pharaoh's sleep remained in harmony with the stars. Yet, in all this divine design, there was no one to speak with candidly, no confidant behind the incense smoke, no room for simple vulnerability. The pharaoh's wives, concubines, and royal children were close in blood, but distant in practice. Every relationship was bound by protocol. Affection was regulated by rank. Even love had to be expressed within ritual. A kiss, a gift, a conversation, all choreographed to uphold the image of harmony and grace. The pharaoh could be a father, a husband, a lover, but never merely a man. Not in front of them, in rare inscriptions, we catch glimpses of emotional yearning, references to a beloved wife, a cherished child, a long-missed mother. These moments are striking because they are unusual. The pharaoh wasn't supposed to be tender or nostalgic. He was meant to be unshakable. But those soft notes suggest that under the rigid exterior of godhood, loneliness did visit, quietly, persistently. Sleep offered no relief. Even in dreams, the pharaoh was on display. His subconscious became a matter of state. If he dreamt of water rising too fast, or of being chased by shadows, he awoke to find priests waiting to interpret the omen. Sometimes the dream was shared with the court, discussed in temple halls, responded to with rituals or policy. He could not even confess fear without it being translated into divine language and etched into the scrolls of statecraft. And so, the pharaoh withdrew. Some developed habits of midnight prayer, not in temples, but alone, by a lamp or open window, whispering to gods who never answered in words. Others wrote letters never sent to deceased parents or imagined deities. A few collected charms or trinkets of no official value. A child's carved toy, a servant's handmade amulet, a bracelet given in youth. Objects that reminded them, quietly, that they had once been boys, not just pharaohs. There were moments, too, when loneliness turned into paranoia. Not all pharaohs handled isolation well. Some became suspicious of those around them, dismissing advisors, rotating guards, accusing wives or scribes of treason. Others fell into silence, refusing counsel, making decisions from instinct rather than deliberation. The pressure to be perfect, immortal, and beloved had its price. Yet, through it all, the rituals continued. The chamber was cleaned, the linens refreshed, the oils replenished. At sunset, musicians played. At night, incense burned. The image was maintained. The myth held steady. And every morning, the pharaoh awoke, or was woken, to once again become a god, and still. Under the gold-threaded canopy, he sometimes lay awake, staring at the ceiling painted with stars, and wondered, would anyone ever know who I truly was? Would anyone want to? And even the ruler of Egypt, for all his power, couldn't escape the most human of desires, the longing for genuine connection, unfiltered by duty or divinity. When you picture a pharaoh, chances are you're seeing not just a crown and scepter, but a face, smooth, ageless, framed in thick black eyeliner, and a serene, distant expression. That was no accident. Every line, every shimmer, every swipe of paint was intentional. In ancient Egypt, appearance was not vanity, it was theology. A pharaoh didn't simply look divine, he had to, or else the illusion cracked. Cosmetics were central to this performance, not a detail reserved for women, not a fashion statement. For pharaohs, cosmetics were tools of state, weapons of protection, and symbols of order in a world that constantly threatened chaos. Let's start with kohl, that deep black eyeliner you've seen in statues and wall reliefs. It wasn't just for looks. It was believed to protect the eyes from the harsh desert, sun, from disease, and most importantly, from the evil eye. Made from ground galena and mixed with oil or animal fat, it was applied with a smooth stick or red, carefully drawn to extend beyond the eye's edge like a falcon's wing, a nod to Horus. Kohl wasn't hastily smeared. It was a ritual act, performed by specialists trained not only in cosmetics but in sacred symbolism. Each morning, before stepping into the royal court or the temple, the pharaoh was painted into godhood, literally. The black around his eyes said, "I see like the gods. I see through illusions. I ward off evil." But it didn't end there. Pharaohs wore colored pigments on their cheeks and lips, soft reds made from crushed ochre or iron oxides. These added life to the face, warmth to the divine image. A pale or colorless complexion could be seen as weakness, even illness. So the pharaoh's face was kept radiant, not just to appear healthy, but to symbolize eternal vitality. And then there was gold, the skin of the gods. The pharaoh's crowns, necklaces, collars, sandals, even facial masks used in ceremonies or death rites were layered with gold. It wasn't about shine, it was about permanence. Gold didn't rust. It didn't fade. It reflected the light of the sun god Ra. When a pharaoh adorned himself in gold, he wasn't showing off. He was aligning himself with the solar cycle, declaring, "I, too, am eternal." This was true even in death. The famous burial mask of Tutankhamun, with its inlaid lapis, obsidian, and turquoise, was not just funerary art, it was a theological blueprint. The black kohl lines, the serene lips, the glowing cheeks, all recreated in stone and gold, to ensure the pharaoh would look divine in the afterlife, just as he had in life. But beauty, of course, came at a cost. Maintaining the pharaoh's appearance was a full-time job. He had attendants, sometimes called cosmetic priests, whose duties included mixing pigments, cleaning applicators, sharpening kohl sticks, and ensuring that no blemish appeared unaddressed. Small mirrors made from polished copper helped them catch imperfections, and when one was found, a pimple, a scar, a discoloration, it was often treated with herbal remedies, perfumed oils, or simply painted over. Yet even pharaohs were subject to smudging. Festivals were long. Ceremonies under the sun caused sweat to break the perfect line of eyeliner. Tears, whether from emotion, pain, or sand in the wind, left tracks down powdered cheeks. And still, the ritual of appearance had to be maintained. Between public events, pharaohs were often reanointed, repainted, redressed. Even in battle, legends say that some pharaohs had cosmetics reapplied before charging into battle, so that the enemy would not see a disheveled man, but a divine warrior. Still, beneath all this artistry, one question quietly pulsed: did the pharaoh believe in the image he wore? Was the kohl mask one of power or protection. What happens when a king must wear his own face like a costume? The pharaoh's face, so carefully crafted each morning into divine symmetry, did not always hold. Sandstorms, blue tears welled. The desert heat, relentless, unyielding, did not respect the sacred lines of coal or the shimmer of gold-dusted cheeks. Despite the ritual precision, the public ceremonies, and the layers of oil, pigment, and polish, the pharaoh was still bound by the human body, and bodies betray. A single streak of smudged eyeliner, noticed by a scribe, whispered about by a priest, could spiral into theological discomfort. Was it just heat? Or had the gods withdrawn their favor? Did the smudge mean the pharaoh was tired, vulnerable, mortal? In a society obsessed with matte, even cosmetic imperfection suggested a crack in the cosmic order. So correction became a sacred duty. Enter the touch-up priests, attendants trained in both the art of makeup and the choreography of invisibility. They worked quickly, silently, almost invisibly, refreshing the pharaoh's image between rituals, adjusting necklaces, blotting sweat with perfumed cloth, repairing the black winged lines beneath the eyes with swift, practiced strokes. They were not beauticians. They were guardians of illusion, and the illusion mattered deeply to the crowds gathered along temple corridors, or the officials watching from gilded colonnades. The pharaoh had to appear eternal, not young necessarily. Age could be a sign of wisdom, but unchanged, consistent, beyond fatigue, above blemish. To see the pharaoh look tired was to glimpse the edge of chaos. Of course, the pharaoh knew this. He lived with mirrors, polished copper surfaces that reflected every flaw, every imperfection. He endured the daily process of reconstruction, the shaving of scalp and body, the application of oils, the brushing on of pigment, the layering of ceremonial wigs, jewelry, and perfumes. It was armor, not against arrows, but against doubt. Still, the tension grew with time. Older pharaohs began to feel the strain, the sagging skin beneath gold collars, the creases at the corners of eyes framed in ink. There were no retouches for dignity. And while the public image could be managed, private reflection couldn't be so easily blurred. Some records suggest that aging pharaohs reduced their public appearances, relying more on statues or symbolic substitutes. The presence of the pharaoh became metaphysical, invoked through chants, images, and offerings, rather than flesh and voice. In fact, statues were sometimes more present than the pharaoh himself. They didn't sweat, they didn't blink, they never smudged. In temple halls, colossal stone effigies of the king performed rituals on his behalf. Priests dressed them, anointed them, offered food to them, and the people accepted this as real presence. A perfect face carved once could last 1,000 years. The pharaoh's actual aging face, it lasted only as long as the pigments could cover it. But even statues had to be updated. If a pharaoh aged too obviously, new portraits were commissioned, smoothing away wrinkles, idealizing form. This wasn't vanity. It was preservation, not of appearance, but of authority. The pharaoh was not merely a man, but an ideal. His image could not be allowed to decay, even if the man beneath was visibly doing so. Yet behind all these layers of presentation lay an undercurrent of fragility. Imagine the pharaoh, late at night, wiping away his makeup in a polished copper mirror, the kohl fading, the pigment rinsed off, the gold collar unfastened, the divine facade undone. In the quiet of his chamber, he saw not Horus, not Ra, but a man, tired, a little heavier, a little more lined than last year, and perhaps, for just a breath, he wondered, is this enough? Not as king, not as God, but as himself, because being divine by expectation is not the same as being accepted without adornment, and the question lingered, would the gods still see him as worthy? Without the eyeliner, would the people? By the end of his reign, the pharaoh had worn the same face for decades, a sacred mask composed of ritual, repetition, and reverence. Every morning, the cosmetics were reapplied. Every wrinkle was softened with oils. Every flick of kohl restored. The illusion of immortal poise. But beneath the shimmering surface, a quiet truth settled into the folds of linen and the silence. Between ceremonial chants, the pharaoh was fading. Even the attendants noticed, subtly, cautiously. The mirror rituals took longer. The skin no longer absorbed oils as it once had. The sacred wig, once fitted effortlessly atop a smooth scalp, now sat heavier on a stooping neck. And yet, no one dared speak of it. Not the cosmetics priests, not the royal wives, not even the physicians. They all participated in the maintenance of myth, carefully preserving the appearance of divinity. Even as the divine vessel aged like any other man but the pharaoh. Now reflecting mortality, the kohl no longer brought confidence, only camouflage. The rich pigments that once gave the illusion of youth now clung to sun-worn skin like fading memories. Still, he allowed it all, the painting, the perfuming, the polishing, not out of vanity, but out of obligation. His body was no longer just his own. It belonged to the realm, to the gods. Toward the end of a pharaoh's life, preparations for the final portrait intensified. Not a painting, but a death mask. Crafted from gold and inlaid stone, it would be the pharaoh's most enduring image. Proportions, idealizing features. The wrinkles vanished. The tiredness softened. It was meant for time itself, to survive centuries, to tell strangers in future ages, this is what a god looked like. But it was a lie, and everyone knew it. Not a malicious lie, but a necessary one. A lie that protected truth by dressing it in beauty. The pharaoh, for all his power, had aged. He had weakened. He had been frayed. And yet, through ritual and image, he had preserved the illusion of perfect kingship, and perhaps that, in the end, was the point. Because even gods, the pharaoh looked like a god, acted like a god, and died like a god. Egypt could carry on. The Nile would flood. The artisans placed the finished mask in its shrine, and the pharaoh, now quiet, wrapped, and sealed. To imagine a pharaoh as a man of action, commanding armies, overseeing temple rites, bestowing favors with a single gesture of his golden hand. But in truth, the most persistent sound in the palace wasn't the clang of bronze or the rhythm of drums. It was the scratch of reeds on papyrus. For, if the pharaoh ruled Egypt, it was the scribes who made Egypt work. And they worked a lot. Every decree, every grain counted, every ritual observed, every goat born on temple land. It all had to be written down, not out of obsession, but because in the Egyptian worldview, to write was to give permanence, was an administrative nerve center, humming with scribes crouched on reed mats, pens in hand, ink cakes nearby, and stacks of papyrus piled around them like desert dunes. Their backs ached, not from battle, but from hunching for hours, recording taxes, dreams, border complaints, and offerings to local crocodiles. On them completely, he issued commands, but scribes made them real. He dreamed of temples, scribes drafted the budgets. He asked for a monument, scribes noted how many laborers, how much limestone, and how many jars of beer were needed to feed the workers. Every aspect of governance, ritual, and military strategy passed through a reed pen, and there was always more to write: census records, tax scrolls, temple inventories, oracle responses, military dispatches. Even cosmetic supplies for the royal chamber were tracked. How many cones of lotus wax, how much cedar oil, how many fresh reeds for the eyeliner brush. The pharaoh's life was surrounded not just by walls and guards, but by layers of documentation to manage this paper empire. The pharaoh appointed overseers of scribes, men with intimidating titles like chief scribe of the royal archives or sealbearer of the scroll of grain. These men had access to everything: land records, priestly rituals, even confidential communications from governors. And if they turned against the pharaoh, the consequences were dire, not just politically, but spiritually. It feared rebellion of the pen, the quiet, subtle rewriting of history. And it happened. Some scribes, loyal to a rival faction, edited records, misdated events, or buried documents. A pharaoh's reign could be lengthened or shortened by a chisel. His victories inflated, his failures erased. Tomb inscriptions were crafted from templates, but each scribe added flourishes, a poetic line here, a correction there. In time, the pharaoh's legacy was no longer what had happened, but what had been written. This knowledge weighed heavily on the pharaoh. So he courted them, rewarded them with land, gold, or status. He attended scribe festivals. One particular celebration, the Feast of Thoth, honored the god of writing and wisdom. During this event, pharaohs sometimes made symbolic offerings of ink or red pens, publicly praising scribes as the hands that carry order through time. Still, tension remained. Scribes were indispensable, but they could also become gatekeepers of truth. If the pharaoh said one thing and the scribes recorded another, which version survived? The answer was almost always the written one. So, pharaohs, despite their divine posturing, often read the records themselves. In private chambers, with trusted advisors, they reviewed grain tallies, temple logs, and diplomatic letters. Some kept personal journals, not diaries, but fragments of thought scratched onto limestone shards or tucked into sealed scrolls. These were rarely read by others. They were reflections, self-justifications, sometimes even confessions, because even a god-king needed to be heard, even if only by himself. And through all of this, the scribes kept writing. The ink kept flowing. The pharaoh's commands were translated into numbers, schedules, inventories, and decrees. His voice echoed, not in song or battle, but in black lines on papyrus. But what happened when the paperwork became too much? When even the pharaoh, divine ruler of the two lands, began to drown in documentation. At first, the paperwork was a tool, a way for the pharaoh to extend his will across the deserts, rivers, and bustling cities of Egypt. A decree here, an inspection there, a grain count updated by moonlight. But over time, the tool began to grow teeth. The scrolls piled up. The scribes became more numerous, their departments more specialized. The archives expanded into entire buildings, some larger than temples. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pharaoh's power shifted from proclamation to procedure. He could no longer declare a festival without 5 layers of scribe approval. Use scrolls, labor rosters, quarry permits, and astrological clearance for the chosen dates. Want to send an army to the Delta? Prepare for a full day of reviewing supply logs, past campaign reports, ink, and the kingdom's bureaucracy was relentless, in theory. Everything flowed upward. Regional governors sent reports to palace officials. But in practice, the river of information was muddy. Reports contradicted each other. Scribal offices disagreed on tax percentages. One department ordered the construction of a granary, while another scheduled the same site for a sacred grove. Planting. To untangle the mess. The pharaoh held bureaucratic councils gatherings where scribes and overseers argued quietly. They required offerings to Thoth, and they always ended with someone being told to consult the earlier scrolls. A dispute over border stones in Upper Egypt, a priest requesting additional incense for lunar rites. Practices in Nile-side markets. None of these could be ignored. Or rather, he had trusted readers, elite scribes, who summarized documents aloud while he bathed. Sometimes, while being fitted with his ceremonial beard, he would be briefed on grain output in the Fayum. Other times, during a ritual walk through a temple, his scribe would whisper updates on goat births or an outbreak of tooth rot in the scribe school dormitories. Governance did not pause for incense or crowns. Yet despite this constant attention, the pharaoh had to issue a divine pardon, complete with ceremony and compensation. Another case records a high priest mistakenly buried alive due to a scribal mix-up between 2 names with nearly identical hieroglyphs, both pronounced Intef, both very much alive at the time of the error. One was returned to the surface after 3 days of chanting, but doing so came with risk. Overriding a temple's grain record might offend its priesthood. The paperwork had become sacred in its own right, a form of divine authority, nearly equal to the voice of the king and the pharaoh. For all his divine aura was bound by it. Some tried to streamline the mess. One pharaoh ordered the burning of redundant scrolls, a dramatic and ultimately ineffective gesture, as scribes simply recopied them by habit. Another created a scroll of royal focus in which only matters of cosmic importance could be presented. Within a year, the scroll had ballooned into 7 volumes. Times, the pharaoh might retreat to a quiet chamber surrounded by unopened dispatches and ask aloud, not to his scribes, but to the gods, "Is this what kingship has become?" Paper and ink and questions without end. Because while war could be won and temples could be built, the bureaucracy was eternal. It grew, it adapted, or by his clerks. By the final decades of many pharaohs' reigns, the throne remained steady, but the scrolls had taken over. Not literally, perhaps, but close enough. It had become an archive, a living library, humming with the quiet authority of men who knew how to control information. But the day-to-day machinery of Egypt, its grain shipments, its border patrols, its temple allowances, was in the hands of scribes, and some of them were very good at what they did. Too good, there were scribes who kept dual records, one for the pharaoh, one for the temple. Others held entire branches of knowledge hostage in their heads. Tax systems, land divisions, agricultural quotas. To replace them would mean relearning systems too vast and confusing to recreate. Pharaohs kept them close, and the scribes knew it. They developed their own quiet power, a bureaucratic priesthood, answering not to gods, but to procedure. When he requested action, they asked if the proper authorization scroll had been sealed. Perhaps next quarter, and the pharaoh began to feel it, that creeping sensation of power diluted, of being bound not by divine law, but by administrative precedent. Some pharaohs rebelled. Briefly, one attempted to bypass the scribes altogether, issuing direct orders to regional governors via couriers. The governors, confused, sent the messages back, marked unconfirmed. Without proper scribe verification, the orders were considered invalid. Another pharaoh dismissed his chief scribe during a full moon ceremony. Within a week, nothing worked. Scribes staged quiet delays, lost scrolls, misfiled petitions. The pharaoh apologized and reinstated him. At that point, even the most powerful kings realized, you don't rule Egypt without the scribes. They weren't just paper pushers. They were gatekeepers of memory, logic, and continuity. They outlived pharaohs. They trained their sons in the art of ink and form. May have stood at the center of every carving, but it was the scribe who wrote the caption. It was he who chose which victories to emphasize, which failures to soften, which laws to preserve. A pharaoh who offended his scribes might one day find himself remembered not as a god, but as an asterisk. And so, kings adapted. They began to speak the language of the scribes. Philosophy, but to check the math. Even tomb inscriptions changed. Where once they declared, "I am the son of Ra," they began to include more detail. I confirmed the harvest record. I ensured the priestly rations. I approved the grain tax. Relief. The divine became administrative. Eternity was recorded in cubic cubits and certified by official seals. And yet, there was a quiet kind of poetry in it. Egypt was a land of order, of measure, of record. A pharaoh's reign, no matter how glittering, was only real if it was written down. And perhaps that's why, in the end, many pharaohs chose to be remembered not just as conquerors or builders, but as keepers of balance. They ruled not just with flails and crowns, but with ink and signature. Not just from the throne, but from the margins of scrolls carried by ink-stained men in simple linen. Because long after the gold faded and the statues crumbled, top, alone in power, alone in judgment, alone in divinity, but never alone in the palace. Not really. Not even in the dead of night. Not in the bath. Not in the quietest corners of the royal garden. Because behind every curtain, beneath every pillar, and beside every doorway, someone was watching. Privacy, as we know it today. Advisors and laborers all moved in a choreographed rhythm, designed to maintain the machinery of royal life. And in that rhythm, the pharaoh's personal moments were consumed by procedure. Every footstep was anticipated, not metaphorically, quite literally. Small niches were built into certain corridors to allow attendants or guards to remain close without being seen. Whispering galleries, some say, a marvel of palace acoustics. They knew the pharaoh's moods, his habits, his voice, his silences. They saw him when the crown was off and the wig was stored. They were the ones who brought him his first water at dawn, who adjusted the kohl around his eyes, who cleaned the stains from the ceremonial kilt. And they talked, not publicly, not loudly, muttered prayers under his breath when he thought no one heard. The man behind the monument. Then there were the guards, ever present, ever silent. Their job wasn't just protection from threats, it was containment. The pharaoh could not simply wander the grounds. Every movement required clearance. His routes were scheduled, his audiences timed. If he walked alone in a garden, it was because someone had allowed it, and someone was likely following at a discreet distance. Informants, the unseen network of whisperers embedded in palace life. The pharaoh needed to know what his priests were plotting, what his generals murmured, what his own sons discussed after dark. And so, a quiet army of listeners moved through the palace eunuchs, scribes, assistants, idle cupbearers, people trained not to speak. Briefings. The priests of Ptah have extended evening prayers again. Or the grain accountant seemed tense today. Or the queen's handmaid returned from the kitchens with red eyes. These were not casual notes, these were clues, and the pharaoh pieced them together in silence. Even laughter was not always safe. A joke made at dinner could echo down the halls and return twisted. A private comment, overheard through stone, might re-emerge as an accusation. The walls of the palace did not echo, they retained, and yet the pharaoh maintained the performance. He smiled in ceremonies. He listened to petitions. He played his part, knowing that every reaction was watched, every yawn interpreted, every hesitation noted. In time, the pressure forged habits. Some pharaohs developed layers of coded speech, saying one thing and meaning another, even with trusted advisors. Others became withdrawn, relying only on omens and dreams. One was said to have held meetings only in open courtyards, so that no stone could trap his words. Another gave false instructions to his attendants, just to see. Where the information would leak, there were. But even they were watched. In Egypt, no one was truly beyond suspicion, so the pharaoh walked softly, even in his own halls, not for fear of treachery, always, but for fear of misunderstanding. A wrong word in the wrong ear could spread like desert wind, fast, invisible, and devastating. But what toll did this take on the pharaoh's spirit? What happened when a man could never truly speak freely, never truly rest? When you're pharaoh, even your silences make noise. A pause in conversation can be a political statement. A long glance toward a servant can shift the mood of an entire chamber. A sigh in front of a scribe might be reported as discontent. And over time, the pharaoh learns, painfully, quietly, that he no longer owns his body, his words, or even his silence. That kind of life wears thin. The throne room is full of deference, bows, praises, titles, recited like songs. But in the privacy of his own chambers, where incense wafts and linen drapes ripple in the breeze, the pharaoh finds no real reprieve. There are always eyes, always ears. The servants he trusts most are the ones closest to the priests. The guards stationed outside his door may also be feeding reports to the vizier. Even the women in his harem, adorned in gold and trained in grace, were often sent as political gifts from powerful families, their loyalties split between lover and lineage. And so, the pharaoh begins to live in layers. The public face is flawless, measured, serene. The ceremonial voice speaks with divine authority. But inside, beneath the polished facade, is a man who sometimes forgets what his true voice even sounds like. In moments of rare solitude, fleeting, scheduled, always monitored, some pharaohs spoke out loud, not to anyone, just to hear themselves think. A few wrote brief phrases on potsherds, discarded after a single reading. Others composed poems, prayers, fragments of emotion hidden beneath ritual language. They see my face, but not my thoughts. I am crowned, but I do not rest. The sun warms my skin, but no light reaches my heart. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of preservation. To remind themselves they were still human, still thinking, still feeling beneath the limestone smile. And yet, every attempt to carve out private space seemed to collapse beneath its own weight. A favorite servant who listened too closely, a temple guard who reported when the pharaoh left his quarters. Early, even bathwater, warm, scented, relaxing, might be tested by palace physicians for signs of illness. Was the pharaoh sweating too much, sitting too long, taking too short a breath? Because every detail was data. The palace had become a living scroll, not one of words, but of observations, written in gestures, annotated in glances, footnoted with rumors. And the pharaoh, the supposed author of all things, was merely the subject. In some dynasties, pharaohs created secret chambers, not for treasure, but for stillness, rooms hidden behind false walls, barely large enough for a stool, and an oil lamp, not for plotting, just for breathing. These rooms left no incense trails, no footprints on polished stone, and in them, a pharaoh might do the rarest of things, say nothing at all, but secrecy breeds suspicion. If discovered, these quiet havens could become scandal. Why was the divine ruler hiding? What was he doing alone? What was he saying to the shadows? So even silence, carefully constructed, became politically dangerous. Eventually, some pharaohs stopped trying. They accepted the surveillance as part of kingship. Like the crowns and the collars, it was heavy but necessary. Others embraced ritual as refuge, hiding in the precision of ceremony, not because they believed, but because ritual didn't ask questions. You said the words, poured the water, burned the offering, and for a moment you were free from decision, from surveillance, from yourself. But the need for real solitude never went away. It simply retreated, like the sun over the dunes, waiting for the hour when the servants left, the guards dozed, and the torches burned low. And in that flickering half-light, the pharaoh might finally whisper, "Where am I beneath all of this?" Because when you are always seen, always judged, always recorded, you begin to wonder whether you still exist outside the record. But what happens when even death cannot grant privacy, when your body is prepared, displayed, wrapped, painted, and sealed for eternal viewing? What if the pharaoh's most private moment was never private at all? For ordinary people in ancient Egypt, death marked a passage into privacy, a return to silence, to the earth, to anonymity. For a pharaoh, it was quite the opposite. Death was not a quiet departure. It was a public transition, a grand performance, a cosmic statement that required audience, ritual, and documentation. Even in the afterlife, the pharaoh was watched. The process began immediately. As soon as the pharaoh breathed his last, surrounded, of course, by priests, officials, and likely a few attendants ready to take notes, the palace sprang into controlled chaos. The royal body was no longer a man. It was a sacred object, untouchable to all but the chosen few. Every moment of its handling was dictated by scroll, custom, and centuries of precedent. First came the cleansing, a ceremonial washing of the body with blessed waters, perfumes, and sacred oils. It was not done in isolation. The pharaoh's body was naked, but never alone. Hands touched him not with tenderness, but with choreography. Eyes remained fixed on every detail, recording, memorizing, judging. Each with amulets tucked between folds, each accompanied by murmured incantations. The chest was wrapped with care, the limbs bound to preserve form, the fingers sometimes individually wrapped to maintain their sacred gesture. One embalmer might pause to consult a scroll. Another adjusted the angle of the left foot. The pharaoh's face, once adorned each morning with paint and gold, was now sealed beneath resin, cloth, and spell, but privacy, still impossible. Even in this moment, the most intimate of transitions, the pharaoh was under constant theological surveillance. Priests invoked Thoth and Osiris. Scribes recorded each step. His tomb builders worked in tandem, preparing murals, inscriptions, and sculptures to ensure the pharaoh would not be forgotten. Not in body, not in face, not in myth. And therein lay the paradox. For a pharaoh to achieve eternal life, he had to be eternally visible. The tomb was no hiding place. It was a monument, a stage. His body was laid out beneath paintings of his finest hours. His name was repeated on every wall, his lineage engraved in cartouches. He was surrounded not by silence, but by narration. Even in death, the pharaoh was performing for gods, for ancestors, for time itself. His final portrait, the death mask, captured a version of him he might not have recognized. Calm, youthful, serene, the kohl perfect, the lips still, the brow unworried, a face preserved, not as he died, but as he ought to have appeared. And that mask, whether made of gold or simply painted wood, would be the last and most enduring expression of a life lived under constant observation. And still, the exposure didn't end there. Over time, tombs were entered, sometimes by priests performing rituals, sometimes by robbers seeking treasure, and thousands of years later, by archaeologists. The pharaoh's remains were displayed, catalogued, photographed. His name was spoken again, not in prayers, but in podcasts. His face, once hidden beneath layers of cloth and secrecy, now stared up at modern glass, dissected by museum lighting. His bones measured and DNA sampled. Even in death, the pharaoh could not be left alone. His afterlife was public, his dreams dissected, his privacy eternally deferred. Because once you are pharaoh, once your body becomes the symbol of a nation, a religion, a people's hope for continuity, you never go unseen again. Not even when the torches go out. Not even when the tomb is sealed. Not even, perhaps, when your soul finally crosses into the field of reeds. Because someone, a servant, a scribe, a stranger, is always watching. Long before the final breath, long before the priests murmured, over linen and resin, a pharaoh was already preparing for his burial. Not emotionally, not in whispered moments of reflection, but logistically, administratively, even architecturally. For a pharaoh, death wasn't a mystery. It was a project. One that began not at the end of life, but at the very start of his reign. The moment a king was crowned. Somewhere deep within the bureaucracy, a scribe opened a new scroll, not for taxes or conquests, but for tomb construction. Building a home for eternity wasn't just tradition, it was state policy. Because while others hoped for a pleasant afterlife, the pharaoh expected it and had to plan it meticulously. Most pharaohs didn't just inherit power. They inherited a death to-do list, designing a royal tomb. Whether a colossal pyramid or a rock-cut chamber hidden in a cliff required massive planning. Architects were summoned, astrologers consulted, quarrymen dispatched. Sacred geometry had to be honored, the alignment of stars, the cardinal points, the proportions of the king's body measured to divine ratios. This wasn't just architecture, it was theology in stone. And it started immediately. Within the first year of a pharaoh's rule, a location was chosen. If he was an old kingdom ruler, this might be Giza, Saqqara, or Dashur, flat desert lands for towering pyramids. In later dynasties, like the New Kingdom, the focus shifted to Thebes and the Valley of the Kings, where tombs were carved directly into the limestone cliffs, hidden from view, protected by secrecy. But secrecy didn't mean simplicity. Even the hidden tombs were elaborate. Corridors twisted deep into the earth, chambers opened like lotus petals. Every surface was planned for decoration, not random, not decorative, but narratively loaded. Walls showed the pharaoh greeting the gods, sailing with Ra across the sky, defeating the serpent, Apophis, in knightly battle. These images weren't just for show, they were guides. The pharaoh was expected to navigate the underworld like a seasoned traveler. The tomb was his map, and the map took decades to make. Laborers worked in shifts. Craftsmen carved in silence, guided by overseers with scrolls of precise instruction. Some pharaohs micromanaged the process, reviewing sketches, approving pigment choices, requesting revisions to a depiction of Osiris that didn't show quite enough beard. Others left it to priests and architects, but all understood the same truth. If the tomb was incomplete when they died, their afterlife was at risk, because the afterlife for a pharaoh wasn't just floating among stars. It was a test filled with gates, judges, demons, and riddles. The body had to be preserved. The name had to be spoken. The tomb had to be stocked with everything he would need: furniture, food, cosmetics, wine, board games, weapons, scrolls, and statues of servants, called shabtis, who would labor on his behalf in the field of reeds. And each of these items had to be ordered, crafted, catalogued, and blessed, all while the pharaoh was still alive. So the living god spent his mornings overseeing state affairs, and his afternoons, in many cases, approving the color of ceiling stars in the hallway to the second sarcophagus chamber. Because death wasn't a pause, it was a continuation. And to continue well, the pharaoh had to ensure every detail was correct. Some tombs grew too large, costs spiraled. One pharaoh extended his burial chamber 6 times, unsure if he'd ruled long enough to earn a full corner gallery. Others died young, leaving rushed, cramped tombs painted in haste. Tutankhamun's tomb, now the most famous in the world, was modest by royal standards, a plan B, finished in a hurry after his early death. But that was the risk. You could start your tomb at 20, and still, if you died at 30, there was no time to finish the story in stone. So the pharaoh kept planning. Every morning, priests reviewed the tomb schedule. Every month, progress was reported alongside grain harvests and temple budgets. And some pharaohs, toward the end of their reigns, visited their tombs in progress, walking the corridors, feeling the stone beneath their sandals, picturing the murals that would one day surround their silent form. But how much of this preparation was truly about belief, and how much about control? Because, while life was filled with uncertainty, this, at least, could be organized, measured, sealed. So what happened when control slipped? When tombs were robbed, records lost, or dynasties overturned? Could all those decades of planning be undone in a single night? The pharaoh had spent decades preparing, selecting the tomb site, overseeing designs, stocking it with everything from sacred scrolls to jars of honey. The corridors were painted with constellations, the doors aligned with star paths, the sarcophagus carved from red quartzite or black basalt. The priests had said the right words. The artisans had done their part. The burial was complete. And then someone broke in, because even in the land of gods and golden masks, nothing was safe forever. The most carefully laid plans, the most sacred tombs, they could all be undone with a crowbar and a quiet night. It happened more often than most imagine. Despite curses etched in stone and guards posted at tomb entrances, grave robbing in ancient Egypt was a constant shadow over death. Gold, perfumes, fine linens, rare oils, all of it was tempting, especially when the pharaoh had been thoughtful enough to collect it all in one place. Some robbers came from outside, nomads, desperate men, chance opportunists, but many came from within, palace workers, tomb builders, even priests who knew the layouts, the traps, the rituals, and the shortcuts. Some were simply poor. Others were angry. Some believed the pharaoh didn't deserve his treasures in death when his people had gone hungry in life. And while the pharaoh had hoped for eternal peace, he was often granted a second, undignified unveiling, stripped of amulets, disturbed. In his wrappings, his carefully positioned limbs pushed aside in search of hidden gems. The irony was bitter. For all the planning, the pharaoh could not control what came after. He could order his name carved 1,000 times. He could have his tomb filled with spells and guards and painted jackals. But if the guards were bribed, if the kingdom fell, if a new ruler needed funds or favor, even the most sacred burial could be repurposed in later dynasties, especially during the economic instability of the Third Intermediate Period. Tomb reuse became common. Pharaohs were quietly moved by priests, not out of reverence, but out of pragmatism. Their coffins were stacked, rewrapped, or hidden in cliffside caches. The most famous example, the Deir el-Bahari tomb, where dozens of royal mummies, including Seti I and Ramesses II, were found crammed together, protected not by spells, but by secrecy. Even the Great Pyramids, symbols of eternity, were emptied centuries ago. When explorers opened them in modern times, they found not royal remains, but echoes, bare chambers, looted corridors, stone robbed from the casing for city walls. The pharaohs had built mountains to be remembered, and yet time and ambition had scraped them clean. This reality forced later rulers to rethink death. Some began building smaller, more concealed tombs, hidden in valleys and rock faces. Others reduced the treasure buried with them, hoping to avoid attention. The focus shifted from grand display to clever camouflage. But even then, nothing guaranteed rest, because a pharaoh, no matter how beloved, remained a target for robbers, for rebels, even for successors who wanted to carve their names over his tomb. Destruction wasn't always for loot. Sometimes it was political. Erasing a pharaoh's name was believed to erase his afterlife. That's why so many tombs have names hacked out, replaced, or covered with plaster and repainted to suit the new regime. For the pharaoh, this was a second kind of death, not of the body, but of memory. And perhaps this is why so many spent so much time trying to control the narrative. Not just building tombs, but dictating what should be written about them. Their inscriptions weren't just religious, they were autobiographical. I built the temple at Karnak. I expanded the canal. I brought peace to Nubia. These weren't just boasts, they were proofs, a resume for eternity, a final argument, carved in stone, begging to be believed. Because if the tomb failed, and the body was stolen, and the priests forgot the name, maybe the words would survive. But did the pharaoh ever doubt that? Did he ever sit, old and weary, in a half-lit tomb, corridor, and wonder, what if none of this lasts? What if, in the end, I'm just another name buried under sand? And what happens to a divine legacy when time, not war or thieves, is the thief? Time was supposed to be the pharaoh's ally. After all, he had built for it, designed for it, aligned stones to celestial bodies, carved spells into walls, mummified his body to resist it. The pharaoh had treated time not as a threat, but as a partner, a silent force that would carry his legacy forward through the centuries. But time had other ideas. Despite all the planning, all the ceremony, and all the sacred labor poured into those tombs, almost none of them were left untouched. They cracked, they collapsed, they were looted, forgotten, flooded, sealed, reopened, misidentified. Entire royal necropolises were buried by sandstorms, miscatalogued by later dynasties, or deliberately hidden by priests who no longer had the resources to protect them. In the end, it wasn't just enemies or robbers who undid the pharaoh's work. It was the weight of centuries. Earth shifted, stone settled, paint faded, spells chipped away by tiny grains of dust. The field of reeds may have awaited, but its gateposts were now broken, bleached, and silent. Effort to control death, to script the afterlife in murals and gold, slowly gave way to the unscripted, the unpredictable. In some cases, the forgotten dot. We now know the names of many pharaohs, but for every one remembered, dozens have vanished. Their tombs lost, their mummies disintegrated, their names rubbed from records or mistaken for someone else's. For all the care taken in death, memory proved to be fragile, as delicate as the linen wraps now scattered in museum drawers. Still, something did survive, not the gold, not the food, not even the spirit, as once believed, but the architecture of belief, the very idea that death could be confronted with design, that the unknown could be prepared for like a royal inspection, that a tomb, properly constructed, could be not a prison, but a vessel. Even in ruins, even looted, those tombs speak. The stars painted on ceilings still shimmer faintly beneath torchlight. The Book of the Dead remains readable in parts. Even when the pharaoh's name is gone, the intent remains visible. Someone believed this mattered, that their story was worth recording. that death could be managed, even if life never truly was. And for modern eyes, there's a strange comfort in that the pharaohs may have failed to preserve themselves as they wished. But in doing so, they left behind a map of human effort, stubborn, beautiful, misguided, enduring. Because the truth is, even divine kings couldn't escape the human fear. What if I vanish? What if I'm not remembered? So they built, and carved, and prepared. And now, thousands of years later, someone still reads their names aloud, even if mispronounced. Someone still wonders about their choices, their fears, their plans. Someone still visits their tombs, not to rob them, but to remember them. In a way, it worked. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but the pharaoh's legacy, chipped and weathered, still whispers through time, even if all that remains is dust, darkness, and a painted star on a ceiling no one was meant to see again. When most people imagine a pharaoh, they picture a solitary figure, tall, crowned, wrapped in linen and sunlight. But rarely does that image include the woman standing just behind him, the great royal wife, the queen, draped in sheer linen, perfume clinging to her skin, hands folded in quiet poise. Yet her presence, often overlooked, was deeply political and far from passive. In ancient Egypt, a queen wasn't just a consort, she was a statement. Her title alone, she who holds the seal, mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, or even God's wife of Ammon, carried authority. And while her throne might not be gilded like the pharaohs, her influence was woven into the palace like lotus incense into the air, everywhere. Subtle and hard to remove. The queen was expected to embody beauty, yes, but that beauty was a form of diplomacy. Her perfumes were carefully chosen blends of frankincense and myrrh, markers of refinement and resources. Her garments, often translucent linen, shimmered with status, each fold whispering of trade networks and textile workers. Her makeup wasn't vanity, it was visual power, painted with a priest's precision. But her greatest political tool wasn't her wardrobe. It was her womb, producing heirs, especially male ones, was more than a family matter. It was statecraft. A queen who bore the pharaoh's children helped secure dynastic continuity, reinforced divine legitimacy, and stabilize the fragile balance of succession. In a society obsessed with cosmic order, nothing was more crucial than a clearly defined lineage, and yet she was rarely alone in the royal household. Pharaohs had many wives, especially foreign ones, sent from distant kingdoms as part of diplomatic treaties. These lesser wives arrived with their own customs, their own languages, and sometimes their own political agendas. They lived in the harem, a guarded section of the palace that was part sanctuary, part strategic hotbed. The queen had to navigate this terrain like a stateswoman. She wasn't just raising children, she was managing rivalries, balancing temple alliances, and often defending her son's claim to the throne long before he could even speak. And if she was clever, she'd build alliances with scribes, guards, priests, even perfume makers, anyone who could carry whispers through the marble halls. Some queens, like Nefertari or Tai, became public faces of the monarchy. They were carved into temples, depicted at the pharaoh's side, and sometimes shown the same size as their husbands, an artistic signal that their power was more than ceremonial. Tai, the wife of Amenhotep III, was known to correspond with foreign kings and possibly had her own seal for diplomatic correspondence. She was not a background figure. She was a coroller in all but name. Others wielded influence through religious offices. The role of God's wife of Ammon, for example, allowed elite women, often queens or royal daughters, to control temple wealth and land. In some periods, this religious title carried more practical power than the throne itself, especially in Thebes, where the priesthood rivaled the monarchy.